Good day to everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah McChesney, and on behalf of ProTech Training, I welcome you to today's webinar on how to improve workflow and deliver value faster with Kanban. Today's presentation should be finished at around 30 minutes after the hour. Please let me introduce you to our presenter. Jolly Rajan is passionate about helping organizations achieve the business agility that will help them compete in the global marketplace. He leverages his deep understanding of organizational behavior and his knowledge of the technology landscape in order to deliver impactful transformation of the organizational mindset. He has a proven track record for helping grow high-performing teams that can sustain change over a long period of time. Jolly has helped teams move to a high-performing state using methods like Kanban, which deliver meaningful metrics that drive continuous improvements. With no further ado, I bring you Jolly.
Hi, folks. Thank you, Sarah. So let's get started with Kanban. I picked a wordplay with Kanban, and the title is Kanban Your Flow, how to improve your workflow and deliver value faster. So the word VUCA, the term VUCA, is out in the community, the Agile community in particular, in these circumstances. The acronym comes from the 1980s, when the Army kind of developed strategies on how to combat the post-Cold War world, when the USSR kind of broke apart, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the world. So the term VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the current set of circumstances with the pandemic and all is a perfect example of a VUCA situation. There's a lot of all of these: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in every industry you can pick, be that the software, IT, manufacturing, logistics, any environment that you can imagine. And this is a perfect world for a method like Kanban. And one of the things that you always hear in today's conversations, whether that be on CNBC or any of the business channels, or if you talk to leadership in any of the big organizations and small, like small businesses, mom and pop stores, everyone wants to conserve cash. And obviously, one of the ways to conserve cash is to lay off all your employees or furlough them or close down your business. But there are other ways of doing it, right? I mean, you might have to take some cutbacks, but there are other ways of doing it. One of the biggest problems in big organizations and small organizations is there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of waste in their processes on how the manufacturing happens, how software development happens, how the organizations talk to each other, how within the organizations various units talk to each other. There's a lot of waste. One way to conserve cash and reduce our expenses is to minimize the waste. Another way of doing that is to avoid building up inventory. Toyota kind of perfected this art in the 60s and 70s when they kind of leapfrogged the manufacturing industry by using what they at that time called the Toyota production system. And one of the base of that Toyota production system was Kanban. And that's how they did both. They minimized waste, and they were building up inventory and producing just in time. One of that base method is Kanban, right? So when you hear about Kanban, you normally hear about lowercase or small letter Kanban, and one of the things that it indicates is that it is like a physical thing, right? Kanban, where it started in Japan, is a physical thing, the lowercase or small letter Kanban. What it really indicates is an indication to an upstream system that you need more of what they make, right? So an example of a Kanban is something that looks like this. What it has is a air cleaner, apparently, I think. That's what it says. And it also says that I need a quantity of 4. So what does it say? It is somebody is using this air cleaner for manufacturing an equipment or another bigger part, but they need one of these components to finish that assembly. And they have run out of that part, and they use this Kanban to indicate to that upstream system that they need more of this part. And in this case, they say, I want 4 more at this given point of time. So what is the kind of the upstream impact of this, right? The upstream impact is their upstream systems are only making 4 at a time, which is just in time, and they are not building inventory. They are not also wasting a lot of the components that go into building the air cleaner or the air cleaning system, right? So in every subsequent upstream system, savings are accruing because they are not producing more than what they need, and they are minimizing waste, right? You all might have seen a much more visible version of this at your local pharmacy or at your local Walmart, where when something goes out of stock, they have an indicator there which says restock. In many different establishments, it might look differently, but what it says is it's an indication to go and get the stock from the stock room or order an extra stock from your supplier, and so on and so forth. So every upstream system has a reflection of the fact that a stock is out at a store, and every upstream system kind of integrates or adds up all the restocking requests and orders just in time. The manufacturer also just manufactures just in time to replenish the stock that has gone out. So the inventory buildup is minimized, and so is the waste along the entire system, right? So that is one practical way that you might have all observed without knowing what that means on what Kanban is, right? So now let's talk about the uppercase or big K Kanban. This is the method that we are all familiar with. We all have heard this one way or another. Most of the time we hear Kanban in conjunction with Scrum as two maybe competing processes or methodologies in some respects. But this is the Kanban that uses the principles behind that physical Kanban that we just talked about, the token or the indicator that gets passed to the upstream system to minimize the waste and produce the inventory just in time and produce enough inventory to satisfy the demand. And this is that software method or process or manufacturing process that we are all familiar with, right? So the Kanban method has 4 basic principles. The first one is start with what you know, right? So what it really means is it is meant to be overlaid on existing workflows, systems, processes, without really disrupting what is already working for you, right? Don't mess everything up. It is what is working for you. Let's start there. It allows itself to be applied incrementally so that there is no culture shock or there is no big commitment up front of changing everything that exists. So start with what you know. Right? So this kind of makes it easy to implement in almost any type of organization. And I have seen it being implemented in HR, in legal, in obviously software development, which I'm part of, and in many other systems. Obviously, manufacturing systems have been doing this for years. So start with what you know, and then agree to pursue incremental change, right? So the incremental changes encounter lesser resistance than massive changes that percolate everywhere in the organization. And it also maybe prevents the resistance that builds for the change that is coming. right? Because it's so incremental that you can easily apply it and not have a big backlash, so to speak. Right? While doing this, we respect current processes, roles, and responsibilities. So don't go around changing everyone's job descriptions. Don't go around changing reporting structures, and don't create that overwhelming sense of fear that people feel that when change is coming, right? Every time a change process rolls around, everyone is afraid of losing their jobs, them having to learn new skills and having to adapt to that change. And that brings up a lot of fear. And that's very just human. It is nobody is doing that on purpose. It is very human. So respect the current processes, roles, and responsibilities, and slowly start with incremental changes. The fourth principle is encouraging acts of leadership at all levels, which really means this is not a push down from management. This is not a top-down change. Everyone is empowered to bring up improvement ideas, and the leadership should be available and okay with running those experiments for improvement. So it encourages bottom-up change, where everyone is empowered to suggest ideas based on facts and based on what's going on, and run those experiments to see what kind of impact it has on the organization, and then adjust accordingly, right? So those are the 4 principles of Kanban. Kanban is also rooted in 6 practices, right? So let's examine them one by one. The first one is visualized workflow, and I will get into details of all of this in a second here. The second is limit work in progress. Third is manage flow. Fourth is making policies explicit. Fifth is implementing feedback loops. And sixth is improving collaboratively. Right? So those are the 6 practices that you need to follow to make sure that you are implementing Kanban correctly. All of this are difficult things to do in the long run, but remember the principles. You start where you are, you implement changes incrementally, and you see how those changes have an impact, experiment, see the results, and then go back and fine-tune the changes that you made, right? So let's take this one by one. Visualizing workflow. This is the simplest workflow you can imagine, right? Things are in ready, then the work items go to doing, and then they go to done. In the doing, there might be a ton of activities. You might be, if it is software, which I am more familiar with, there might be software development, there might be testing, there might be reviews, there might be deployments, but this is the simplest you can imagine, right? So if this is the simplest workflow that you can find, stories flow from ready to doing, then they might go from doing to done, and subsequent stories might move faster, but that is the basic principle. This is the simplest kind of workflow you can imagine, right? But it can be even more complicated. This one adds a few more columns or workflow states, so to speak. So items are first in backlog, then in analysis, then they go to a ready section, then they go to development, then they go to test, and then they're finally done, right? So the team has kind of added a few more workflow states because they felt that this more appropriately reflects their current workflow, right? So this applies if you're in the software world, mostly to stories. Now, stories kind of fall through this, right? But not all stories might have the same workflow, right? Everything doesn't have to conform to the same thing. So what is another option? Some stories might need a review and a deployment. Not all stories all stories may not need the review and deployment, but some stories might, right? So you can add that to your workflow. Find workflows that closely match the types of work that you have, right? And it might mean that you might have more than one of these workflows in your team. So one team could have a certain type of work that goes through one workflow and a certain type of work which goes through another. Let me show you another example. This is a workflow where you have a few things in your backlog, which gets sent to a vendor. You are not doing any development at all. You're not doing any testing. Maybe you do a review at the end of it, and then you deploy, and then you're done, right? So those stories does not fit into the previous workflow that I showed you, right? It doesn't go through the development, test, review, deploy, and done. So you have another workflow. So if you are visualizing a workflow, the end result could be multiple workflows. And in a practical sense, you will set up different task boards for all of these workflows. So if you have 4 different workflow types, you will set up 4 different task boards. Right? So the next step in this is limiting work in progress. This is a picture that is very famous in the development community. On the right side, you have a highway that is completely utilized. Everyone is busy. Everyone in the team is busy. The whole highway is utilized. But nobody might be moving, and nothing is getting done because the highway is jam-packed. The utilization is 100%, but the throughput is close to 0 because nothing has been completed. But on the left, the utilization is pretty low, but everyone is moving. People are getting to their homes or getting to their offices, right? So limiting the work in progress, limiting the number of cars on the highway, limiting the amount of things that you do at a given point is very important, which is what Kanban suggests, right? So let's look at that basic workflow again. Already doing done. I just added a backlog to the beginning. What you have when work really starts is what you have a commitment point. And when work gets done, you have the delivery point, right? Between that, you have to limit work in progress, right? So you are working only on 3 things at a time or 2 things at a time, depending on what stage it is in. Getting things to ready requires work. So remember, you need a WIP limit or a work in progress limit on the ready column as well, because somebody like a product owner or somebody is doing work to get that into the ready column, right? So that takes work. And then doing also has a limit because somebody's actually working on it. Let's say the developer or the tester or the deployment person is doing something on it, right? So that also limits has to have a limit on it, right? The done and backlog columns don't have limit because backlog is whatever comes in. It is being continuously groomed, but it is what continuously comes in, and done gets accumulated as you finish work, right? Kanban allows you to have an expedited lane. This is called a class of service. So, but the expedited lane is limited to only 1. So you can exceed your WIP limit, but you can exceed it only by 1 count. This is typically reserved for like catastrophic errors, really urgent requests that needs to go through, but doesn't. There's no room in our board to accommodate it. But then we allow that room to happen because of the expedited lane, right? So you can have, but there is a hard limit on it. We can have only 1, right? So you can also have. I didn't put it here, but you can also have another class of service called, let's say, date-driven, but that also should obey the WIP limit, which means if there are 3 things in ready in date-driven, you cannot have anything in standard. That should be empty, right? But it gives you a clear indication of what your priorities are so that you can get that to done. So why is work in progress so important, right? So a cycle time, which is the time it takes to get anything done, from start to finish, is defined as work in progress over throughput. And this is Little's law. Dr. Little was a professor in operational research. And he came up with Little's law, which defines cycle time as work in progress over throughput. So if you want to reduce cycle time, which is the time it takes to get anything done, you can increase throughput. That's definitely an option, which means that you have to work harder weekends and nights. You can hire more people, or you can temporarily bring in more people, which will have a negative effect. Or you can reduce work in progress, which is one of the key reasons why we try to limit work in progress in Kanban, right? The third practice in Kanban is managing flow. We talked about managing flow using WIP, which is the flow of stories or work items from the left to the right stakes in Kanban. Another important factor, we looked at it in the highway example, is utilization, right? So the more you utilize, the more the weight is. It's pretty clear from your highway example. If highway is 100% utilized, that is, cars are back to back to back, the utilization is great, but you are waiting more and more and more. And this research from Harvard Business Review suggests that every time you go over 80% utilization, you are the weight is doubling, right? So 80 to 90, it doubles. 90 to 95, it doubles again. And it is almost an exponential curve at that point where you're waiting more and more and no stories are getting done. Right? So you don't necessarily want 100% utilization at any point. The third parameter here that can influence your flow is batch size. And batch size in manufacturing terms is the size of the components and the time it takes to do that. In software world, for people who are familiar with Agile terms, it is your story size or your task size, right? But it's influenced by two competing factors. One is the holding cost, which is a linear one. So if you have bigger and bigger stories, you are holding on to it, and that cost keeps going up. The second one is transaction cost, which is if it is infinitesimally small, if your story is really, really small, there's a lot of flashing, right? There's a lot of back and forth and start, you're starting the next one, you're finishing it, you're starting the next one, which increases the transaction cost. So the batch size or the story size, the optimal value is somewhere in between. For many teams, it is probably like 1 to 2 days and not 1 hour, right? Even though 1 hour story sounds exciting, it is not probably very practical. So you have to come up with that. Nobody can really tell you 1 hour or 1 day story is the best for you, right? The fourth practice is making policies explicit, which in Kanban terms for IT is kind of defining what those transition policies are. It also has impact on other policies outside of this board, right? So what are the policies that define how capabilities get defined for a release? What are the policies that define that this release is ready to go to the customer? What are the policies in this board? What are the policies that determine that a story can go from backlog to ready? At the bottom, we say the acceptance criteria should be ready, work items should be estimated. These are simple examples that I wanted to show you. This is not comprehensive by any means. And to go from ready to doing, the design has to be verified, tasks have to be broken down. And from going from doing to done, there are 0 defects and the PO has accepted the story, right? So the idea is that everyone understands what's going on. There is transparency within the organization so that there is no confusion as to what is happening and why it is happening, right? So that is making policies explicit. Implementing feedback loops, the fifth practice of Kanban. Kanban has a few defined activities or ceremonies, as we like to call them in Agile. Some of these ceremonies have direct correlation to the one from Scrum, like the daily stand-up meeting. The replenishment meeting is kind of the grooming or refinement meetings that we have in Scrum. Delivery planning meeting at the beginning of every release. And there's a risk review, there is a service delivery review, operations review, and strategy review. So these are kind of the defined meetings. And the cadence that is given here is just a guidance. It doesn't mean that you have to do exactly that at that given point, but you have to do it as per the cadence that you agree to, right? So that is up to you. There are also feedback loops that can come from some metrics, right? So how responsive are you is determined by how much time does it take to finish every story or task. There's a tool set that is available at the link at the bottom of that slide there, which will help you create all of these statistics. And the idea here is to be stable or steadily improve, right? You don't want massive swings in these numbers, which could be an indicator of an underlying problem that is going to be part of the feedback loop. So you take this data back to your retrospective and say, why is this happening, right? Another of this data is throughput, which is an indicator of productivity, which says, okay, we did X number of stories or defects per week, right? Another one is predictability. How many stories did you start in a week, and how many did you finish? So this blue line indicates that you completed more than you started, and by how much. The orange bar going down indicates you started more than you completed, and by how much, right? You're looking for somewhere in the middle, right? You want this not to be more or less on either side. You want it to be somewhere in the middle, which means that you didn't start much more than you finished, or you didn't finish much more than you started. If it goes 1 or 2 to either side, it is okay, but you want it to be relatively stable. And of course, quality, right? How much of your work was spent on fixing defects? If it is very high, that's a clear indicator that something went wrong, right? So how do you use this as a feedback loop? You are not optimizing for each of these parameters, because some of these are in conflict with other, right? So the idea is to figure out which is more important for you and see how you can tune for that, right? You cannot possibly move all the 4 in the right direction all the time, right? It doesn't mean that you are not improving, but you cannot move them all together all the time in the same direction, right? You cannot do that. So you have to figure out which ones are important and try to balance it. Maybe your responsiveness is increasing, but your quality is going down, right? So you have to adjust for that. Maybe we cannot be that responsive because we are doing a sloppy job of the writing our code. So we have to compensate for that, right? So ultimately, this is a balance. There's decisions that have to be made depending on how the data looks. Right? The last one is improving collaboratively. All these changes that we do is an experiment. You need to see how that impacts your team, measure it, figure out what that means using the feedback loops that you have, and then go back to experimenting again. The idea is continuous improvement and not just a one-time deal. So this happens all the time. For people who are familiar with the lean startup, this is a similar loop there. It goes by build, measure, learn. For Kanban, it's more about we are running experiments, and then we are measuring it, and then we are learning from our mistakes, right? So if you do all of these practices, we might have some slack, we talked about utilization not being 100% and limiting our work in progress. And it might look like we have slack, or hopefully people are not slacking off. It's just that we have slack. And that's not really a bad thing, right? So how can teams use the slack time? They can help each other. They can work on improving quality. They can remove blocks in the system. They have work on improvement items for the team. They can broaden the knowledge base. Then what happens? These are all really good activities. You will end up lowering cycle time, which means that we will deliver value faster. We will have faster feedback cycles, which means that we will have higher quality. We will have improved predictability, which means it is easier to establish SLAs with your users, with your clients, right? And you will have less multitasking, which means fewer context switches, right? All of that results in the fact that the team is not overloaded, which contributes to happy team members, which is ultimately what we might all need at this time especially. So that is Kanban in a nutshell for all of you. Thank you for listening, and I'm sure Sarah has some questions that you might have, and Sarah, if you have any, please send them my way.
The first question I have for you, Jolly, is what are some of the tools that I can use to manage Kanban online?
Oh, yeah. So many companies use Jira. And Jira is not the perfect tool for Kanban, but they do have some really effective plugins that they can use for maintaining and managing Kanban projects. And creating task force and so forth. There is also Lean Kit, which is really good. Trello is really basic but pretty good at doing the basic Kanban techniques. And then I think there is a tool called Kanbanize, which is also pretty decent. So those are 3 or 4 tools that you can use. We can put that into a slide, Sarah, so that when we pass this along, they have a reference.
Wonderful. Thank you. The second question was, Scrum usually says that the team size should be 7+ or -2. What does Kanban recommend?
So that's a good question. I mean, Scrum usually says that the team size should be somewhere between 5 and 9. That's the 7+ or -2. Kanban doesn't say anything particular, right? So Kanban doesn't say there's a limit, upper limit or a lower limit. And I have seen really small Kanban teams and really big Kanban teams in the double digits, as in between 10 and 20 people. But there was this research from Harvard, which came a few years ago, which said that team sizes of 5 is the most effective, right? And in Agile terms, it probably means there is 1 Scrum Master, 1 product owner, and let's say 3 engineers in the team, right? 3 software developers, who are poly-skilled. And that is important. They should be poly-skilled, right? So I have seen those teams. I have seen the 5-6-person teams where there are 4 people working really well together, and their WIP has been 1. They just work on 1 story at a time. But let me tell you, those metrics that you saw, the 4 metrics that you saw, they were really rocking it, even with just 4 people working on 1 story at a time. They were really rocking it. So small teams are the best. But Kanban doesn't say how small it should be or how big it should be.
Wonderful. Well, that actually concludes all the questions that have come in. So at this time, I would just like to thank everybody for joining us. And as you'll see on the screen that Dolly has up there, there's a variety of ways that you can reach out to us if you wanted to gain some training or more knowledge in this topic. And we've also got our website, protecttraining.com, which houses a variety of resources for you to look at, whether it be the upcoming webinars, as well as it houses our past webinar recordings and some articles and blogs. We do have another webinar coming up in 2 weeks' time on May the 7th at 1 p.m., and that will be on how to use business objects analysis tab. And then on May the 26th, we have another one called COVID-19, A Time for Innovation. And that webinar will take a look at how to best take advantage of the potential opportunities that emerge as we emerge out of this pandemic and be ready to face the new reality. So by all means, please visit our resource section on our site. And Jolly, thanks again very much for taking your time to share your expertise with everyone. And everyone, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.